Every October, 1 billion bushels of corn flood the American Midwest, and desperate farmers sell their harvest at rock-bottom prices just to pay the banks. But in Cedar Creek, Raymond Kincaid did the unthinkable. While neighbors queued for miles under thick diesel smoke to cash out, Raymond locked his massive steel bins and walked away. They called him reckless. The bank called him broke. But Raymond wasn't farming for pennies. He was setting a trap for the global market. The air in Cedar Creek, Iowa, during the first week of October smelled like burned diesel, crushed corn stalks, and raw anxiety. The horizon was a hazy golden blur of dust kicked up by hundreds of high-capacity combine harvesters tearing through the endless rows of dry maize. It was the peak of the autumn harvest, a manic 3-week window where a multi-generational family farm could secure its financial survival for another year or slide quietly into foreclosure. At the Hendricks Grain Terminal, the line of commercial semi-trucks and heavy grain wagons stretched for over 2 miles. Down County Road G24. Engines idled, sending thick plumes of black smoke into the crisp autumn sky. Inside the terminal's main office, Boyd Hendricks sat behind a desk cluttered with empty styrofoam coffee cups and 3 different computer monitors displaying the blinking red numbers of the Chicago Board of Trade. Boyd was a short, thick-necked man who had managed the local cooperative elevator for nearly 30 years. He knew the psychology of a farmer better than anyone in the state. He knew that when the grain poured in, panic poured out. "Keep the trucks moving!" Boyd barked into his 2-way radio, his voice raspy from decades of breathing in grain dust. The December futures contract just dropped another 4 cents. If these guys don't dump their loads now, they're going to be eating that corn for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Bring 'em in. Outside, in the cab of a brand-new, jet-black GMC Denali HD truck, Garrett Foley watched the digital readout on his dashboard. Garrett was the largest agricultural operator in the county, farming just over 5,000 acres of prime black dirt bottomland. He believed in 2 things: massive scale and immediate liquidation. His strategy was simple: rip the grain out of the ground as fast as his fleet of John Deere machines could move, haul it straight to Boyd's elevator, take whatever price the market offered, and clear his multi-million-dollar operating notes with the bank before the first snowfall. "Hey, Boyd," Garrett spoke into his radio, a smug grin cutting across his sun-weathered face. "Oh, you see old man Kincaid out there today? I passed his north section an hour ago. He's cutting, but his grain trucks aren't in this line. Don't tell me he's still playing that foolish waiting game." Boyd laughed over the static heavy airwaves. "Raymond Kincaid hasn't brought a single bushel to my scale all week, Garrett. His boy Jesse came by to buy some grease cartridges yesterday, and he looked like he hadn't slept in a month. Raymond's going to hold till winter again. But this year the market's got no bottom. He's drowning and he doesn't even know it yet." 3 miles away, on a gentle slope overlooking the Cedar River Valley, Raymond Kincaid was operating a 10-year-old John Deere 9770 STS combine. The machine lacked the modern touchscreens and automated steering of Garrett Foley's fleet, but Raymond kept it so meticulously clean that the green paint still caught the afternoon sun like glass. Raymond was 58 years old, with eyes the color of a cold winter sky, and hands that looked like they had been carved directly out of oak. Beside the field, standing in a large grain cart pulled by a rugged, mud-splattered Case IH tractor, was his 24-year-old son, Jesse. Jesse's thumbs were flying across his smartphone, refreshing the commodities app every 30 seconds. The numbers were brutal. The local basis, the difference between the Chicago cash price and what the local elevator actually paid, was widening into a chasm. The sheer volume of corn hitting the market had overwhelmed the system. Raymond pulled the massive combine alongside the grain cart, extended the long unloading auger, and engaged the mechanism. A thick, roaring stream of golden corn kernels spilled into Jesse's cart, creating a rising mountain of grain. Raymond cut the engine, stepped out of the cab, and walked down the steel ladder to stand beside his son. "Dad," Jesse said, his voice taut with a tension that had been building for weeks. The Hendricks elevator just posted their cash price. It's down to $3.58 a bushel. That's below our cost of production. If we factor in the seed financing, the diesel we're burning, and the equipment depreciation, we're losing 22 cents on every single bushel coming out of this machine right now. Raymond pulled a handful of corn from the cart, inspecting the moisture and checking for cracked kernels. It's good corn, Jesse. Test weight is heavy. It'll dry well. Are you listening to me? Jesse asked, his frustration boiling over. Garrett Foley's got 6 trucks running non-stop to the river terminal in Hendricks. He told the guys at the feed store that anyone holding grain this year is committing financial suicide. We have a $120,000 to $20,000 land note due to Craig Foster at First Country Bank on December 31st. If we don't start hauling to town today, we won't have the cash to cover it. Raymond threw the handful of corn back into the cart. He looked out over his fields toward his homestead, where 4 massive, towering silver grain bins stood against the horizon like sentinels. Jesse, Raymond said calmly, his voice steady as a heartbeat. When you go to the market when everyone else is there, you aren't a seller. You're a beggar. You take what they throw at you. We aren't begging this year. Fire up the tractor. We're hauling this load back to our own yard. By the second week of November, the harvest was over. The fields around Cedar Creek were stripped bare, leaving nothing but gray, jagged stalks protruding from the freezing soil. A heavy, somber silence fell over the county, broken only by the low, continuous roar emanating from the Kincaid farm. Raymond had done exactly what he promised. He had stored every single bushel of his 300,000 bushel harvest inside his own commercial-grade Brock grain bins. To the untrained eye, the massive silver silos looked like passive storage units. In reality, they were a high-stakes, high-expense industrial operation. To keep that much grain from spoiling, the high-capacity electric aeration fans had to run 24 hours a day, drawing massive amounts of power from the rural electric cooperative to pull cold, dry air through the perforated floors of the bins. Inside the Kincaid farmhouse, the kitchen table was entirely covered by the paperwork of a modern agricultural enterprise. Sarah Kincaid, Raymond's wife of 32 years, sat with a calculator in one hand and a stack of pastel-colored past-due notices in the other. She was a strong woman who had weathered the farm crisis of the 1980s alongside Raymond, but the numbers currently staring back at her were terrifying. "Ray," Sarah said as Raymond walked into the kitchen, shedding his heavy canvas coat and boots by the door. "The liquid propane bill for the grain dryers just arrived from United Co-op. It's $14,200, and the electric bill for the aeration fans is double what it was last month. The suppliers aren't going to wait until spring for their money." Raymond poured himself a cup of black coffee, his face unreadable. "I'll talk to them, Sarah. They know our word is good." "Your word can't pay their wholesale distributors," Sarah replied softly, her voice filled with a deep, systemic fatigue. "And then there's Craig Foster at First Country Bank. He's called twice today. He didn't want to talk to you. He wanted to talk to our accountant. He knows we haven't registered a single grain sale with any elevator in the state. He's getting nervous about the operating line." Before Raymond could answer, the heavy wooden back door rattled, and Jesse stepped into the kitchen. His face was flushed red from the biting November wind. He slammed his leather work gloves onto the counter. "The sensor in bin number 3 went off," Jesse reported, his voice trembling slightly. "There's a hot spot forming in the center of the pile. The moisture content must have drifted up to 16% in that pocket. If we don't turn that grain, move it out of that bin and into another one to cool it down, the whole top crust is going to rot. That's 70,000 bushels of corn that could turn into worthless, moldy garbage in less than a week." Jesse leaned against the counter, looking at his father with a mix of anger and desperation. This is what Garrett was talking about. When you store your own grain, you become your own executioner. If a fuse blows in the night or a fan motor burns out while we're sleeping, we lose everything. If we had just sold at harvest, the risk would be Boyd Hendricks' problem, not ours. Raymond took a slow sip of his coffee. He didn't raise his voice. "If we had sold at harvest, we'd already be broke, Jesse. We just would have had a receipt to prove it. Go fire up the portable auger. We'll start transferring the grain from bin 3 to bin 1 tonight. It's going to be a long night, so dress warm." 3 hours later, under the harsh glare of halogen work lights, father and son stood at the base of the towering steel structures. The wind was howling off the open prairie, dropping the wind chill well below freezing. The heavy steel auger groaned as it began to draw thousands of bushels of corn out of the side of bin 3, throwing a fine, icy mist of grain dust into the air. As they watched the golden stream transfer, a pair of bright headlights illuminated the gravel driveway. A sleek, white commercial pickup truck pulled up, the logo of Hendricks Grain Terminal emblazoned on the door. Boyd Hendricks climbed out, wrapping his heavy wool coat tightly around his waist. He walked over to the auger, shielding his eyes from the flying dust. "Raymond," Boyd yelled over the deafening whine of the machinery. "I was on my way home from the office and saw your lights. I figured you were either working hard or losing your mind." Raymond nodded toward his old acquaintance. "Just moving some grain, Boyd, keeping it healthy." Boyd shook his head, looking up at the massive silver silos. "You're running a dangerous game here, Ray. The USDA just adjusted their export estimates downward. China isn't buying American corn this quarter. They're sourcing everything from South America. The Chicago futures are down to $3.35 today. It's a bloodbath. I can still give you a special contract at $3.30 if you sign over 50,000 bushels tonight. By December, I might not even have space to take it, even if you want to sell." Jesse looked at his father, his eyes practically pleading. To Jesse, $3.30 was a disaster, but it was a disaster they could survive. It would mean no new equipment and another year of scraping by, but it would keep Craig Foster and the bank from taking the land. Raymond looked at Boyd Hendricks for a long, silent moment. The wind whipped between the steel bins, making the iron structures hum like a tuning fork. "I appreciate the drive out here, Boyd," Raymond said, his voice cutting through the noise of the auger. "But my corn stays right where it is. It hasn't finished its job yet." Boyd's face hardened. He turned on his heel and walked back to his truck. "Don't say I didn't warn you, Kincaid. When the bank locks your gates, don't come looking for a job at my elevator." By the first week of December, the financial noose around the Kincaid farm was tightening to the breaking point. The local weekly newspaper, the Cedar Creek Courier, ran a front-page article written by business editor Nolan Brooks, detailing the bleakest agricultural outlook the region had seen in 15 years. The combination of an unprecedented bumper crop across the eastern Corn Belt and a complete collapse in global maritime shipping rates had created an absolute glut of grain. The market was completely broken, and there was no relief in sight. At the local diner, the Copper Kettle, the morning coffee club had shifted from discussing high school football to tracking Raymond Kincaid's impending downfall. Garrett Foley sat at the large round table in the corner, holding court with several other local operators. "Raymond's always thought he was smarter than the rest of us," Garrett said, slamming a thick hand onto the table. "He built those fancy bins 3 years ago, claiming independence from the corporate grain system. Well, look at him now. He's paying interest on his operating loans, paying the electric company to run those fans, and his asset value is dropping by $10,000 a week." Craig Foster over at First Country Bank told my accountant that Raymond's debt-to-asset ratio is approaching the red line. If he doesn't liquidate by the end of the month, the bank's going to force an auction on his equipment. While the town gossiped, Raymond sat in his small, cluttered farm office located in the corner of the machinery machine shed. The room was cold, heated only by a small space heater that rattled constantly. On his desk was a massive, old-fashioned shortwave radio, alongside an old desktop computer connected to a satellite internet dish. Raymond wasn't looking at the local elevator prices. He wasn't even looking at the standard Chicago Board of Trade ticker. Instead, he was focused on a series of complex international maritime shipping logs, South American weather telemetry data, and internal reports from the Brazilian Ministry of Agriculture. He picked up his desk phone and dialed a private number with a Chicago area code. After 3 rings, a gravelly, fast-talking voice answered. "Tully here. Make it quick. I'm looking at 3 different screens." "Warren," Raymond said, leaning back in his creaking wooden chair. It's Raymond Kincaid. Did you look at the river gauge reports for the lower Mississippi that I sent over? There was a brief pause on the line, followed by the sound of shuffling paper. Warren Tully was a retired commodities broker who had spent 40 years in the pits of the Chicago Board of Trade before retreating to a quiet consulting office. He was one of the few men who understood that the true price of grain wasn't determined by how much grew in Iowa, but by how efficiently it could be moved across the globe. I looked at them, Ray, Tully said, his voice dropping an octave. You're tracking something very real, but you're playing with pure dynamite. The water levels at the Memphis gauge are at an all-time low. The barges coming down from Illinois and Iowa can only load to a 7-foot draft instead of 12, and they're cutting tow sizes in half. The river is essentially choked off. That's why the local cash price in Iowa is garbage. Boyd Hendricks and the river terminals can't ship what they've already bought. The grain is trapped in the Midwest. Exactly, Raymond said, his eyes narrowing. But look at the export commitments for late January out of the Gulf of New Orleans. The multinational buyers have already shorted their physical delivery contracts for North European and Asian markets. They assumed the Mississippi would clear up by winter. It's not going to. It's going to freeze early this year. And what about Brazil? Tully asked, his interest clearly piqued. The mainstream media is saying they're on track for a record harvest. The mainstream media is looking at the southern states, Raymond countered, pointing a calloused finger at his computer screen. They aren't looking at Mato Grosso. I've been tracking the satellite vegetative index data. They've had 22 days without a drop of rain during the critical pollination phase for their safrinha corn crop. Their yields aren't going to hit 80% of target. By January, the global market is going to realize there is a massive, unpredicted physical shortage of corn at the exact moment the Western River system is completely frozen shut. Tully let out a long whistle. Ray, if you're right, the cash market is going to invert. The big commercial exporters won't care about the paper price in Chicago. They will be desperate for immediate physical grain that can be moved by rail directly to the deepwater ports. But Ray, that's January. It's December 5th. Can you hold out that long? Your local bank is going to want its pound of flesh before the calendar turns. Raymond looked out the frost-covered window of his office. In the yard, Jesse was using a tractor to clear the light dusting of snow that had fallen overnight. The young man looked defeated, his shoulders slouched against the cold. I have to hold, Warren, Raymond said quietly. If I blink now, the last 30 years of my life belong to Garrett Foley and the bank. The real test came 3 days later, on a bleak Tuesday afternoon. Raymond was under his semi-truck replacing a frozen air brake valve when a sleek black sedan pulled up the gravel driveway. Craig Foster, the senior vice president of agricultural lending at First Country Bank, stepped out of the vehicle. He didn't wear a heavy parka. He wore a sharp wool overcoat and carried a sleek leather briefcase. Raymond crawled out from under the truck, wiping his greasy hands on a rag. Craig, didn't expect to see you out past the pavement. Foster didn't smile. He looked at the towering grain bins, then back at Raymond. Ray, we need to talk. Your accountant sent over your updated balance sheet, and we have a major structural problem. Your $450,000 operating line of credit matures on December 31st. Your interest accrual is outstripping your projected revenue based on current cash prices. I can't extend this line into the new fiscal year without a liquid marketing plan. Jesse walked out of the farm shop, overhearing the conversation. He stood a few feet away, his face pale as he listened to the banker. I have 300,000 bushels of high-test corn sitting in those bins, Craig, Raymond said, his voice steady. That's my collateral. Right now, at $3.35 a bushel, that collateral is only worth $1 million on paper, Foster replied coldly. But if you subtract your commercial storage costs, your fuel debt to the co-op, and the current market basis penalty, your net liquidation value doesn't cover your total liabilities. Garrett Foley has already approached the bank's board. He knows your financial position, Ray. He's offered to assume your North 400 acres and pay off your outstanding land note in full. Effective January 1st. Jesse let out a sharp breath. He's trying to steal our best ground. Foster turned his gaze to Jesse, his expression devoid of empathy. He's offering a liquid solution to a non-performing asset, Jesse. If your father doesn't execute a sale contract with Boyd Hendricks for the entirety of your stored crop by 5 o'clock on December 31st, First Country Bank will deny the renewal of your operating line. We will move to freeze your grain assets and execute a forced liquidation of the real estate. I'm sorry, Ray. It's not personal. It's just the math. Foster handed Raymond a formal, certified letter from his briefcase, turned around and drove away, leaving a cloud of coal dust in the driveway. Jesse looked at the letter in Raymond's hand, his voice cracking with emotion. Dad, please, call Boyd. Sell the corn. We lose the profit, but we keep the farm. If we wait until the 31st and nothing happens, we lose everything. Raymond folded the bank notice and placed it inside his pocket. He looked up at the gray sky, where the first heavy flakes of a true winter blizzard were beginning to fall. The trap is set, Jesse, Raymond said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. Now we see who gets caught in it first. The mid-December blizzard slammed into Cedar Creek with a violence that rattled the farmhouse windows and buried the county roads beneath 3 feet of drifting snow. For 5 days, the sun vanished behind a bruised, iron-colored sky. Temperatures plummeted to 20 below zero, turning the very air into a sharp, breathable glass. While the rest of the county huddled indoors near wood stoves, Raymond and Jesse Kincaid were locked in a desperate, freezing war against the elements to keep their 300,000 bushels of corn alive. Inside the massive steel bins, condensation was the enemy. If the extreme temperature differential between the freezing steel walls and the insulated grain mass created moisture, it would rain inside the silos. The top crust would freeze into an impenetrable dome of rotten, fused corn. To prevent this, the massive aeration fans had to run constantly, but the blowing snow threatened to clog the intake vents. At 2 in the morning, illuminated only by the sweeping beam of a solitary yard light, Raymond and Jesse stood atop the 60-foot ladder of bin number 2, tethered by freezing nylon harnesses. They swung heavy rubber mallets against the frozen intake louvers, shattering the ice buildup so the roaring fans below could breathe. Dad, my hands are totally numb, Jesse screamed over the howling wind, his breath instantly freezing to his thick woolen scarf. If the main breaker trips in this cold, we won't be able to thaw the transfer augers. Keep swinging, Raymond roared back, his own face raw and bleeding from ice crystals whipping through the air. The grain has to breathe. By dawn, the storm broke, leaving behind a silent, brilliant, and utterly frozen world. The Kincaid farm had survived the night, but the physical toll was nothing compared to the financial news that arrived on the morning radio broadcast. Sitting at the kitchen table, Sarah poured boiling water over instant oatmeal while the local agricultural report crackled through the battered radio. The United States Army Corps of Engineers has officially halted all commercial barge traffic north of St. Louis, the announcer stated, his voice flat and clinical. Ice jams on the upper Mississippi River have reached critical mass 3 weeks earlier than historical averages. All major grain terminals along the river corridor have declared force majeure, effectively refusing any new grain deliveries until the ice clears. Local cash bids have plummeted in response. The Hendricks Grain Terminal in Cedar Creek is currently bidding a historic low of $2.95 per bushel. Sarah dropped her spoon. The clatter echoed in the silent kitchen. She looked at Raymond, who was nursing a cup of black coffee, his knuckles bruised and wrapped in electrical tape from the night's work. $2.95, Ray, Sarah whispered, her voice hollow. It's over. Even if you sold it all today, we wouldn't clear enough to pay the cooperative debt, let alone the bank. We're officially underwater. Before Raymond could answer, the crunch of heavy tires sounded in the driveway. Through the frosted window, they saw a massive green John Deere tractor equipped with a snowblower clearing its way up their lane. The tractor belonged to Garrett Foley. Garrett left the massive engine idling and trudged up to the farmhouse porch, knocking loudly on the heavy wooden door. Raymond opened it, letting a blast of sub-zero air into the kitchen. "Morning, Ray," Garrett said, a thick cloud of vapor rising from his mouth. He didn't wait for an invitation to step inside. He wiped his boots deliberately on the rug and looked around the modest kitchen, his eyes landing on the stack of unpaid bills sitting under a coffee mug. "What do you want, Garrett?" Raymond asked, his voice low and dangerous. "I'm just doing a neighborly wellness check," Garrett said, offering a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "And I wanted to give you a heads up. I just got off the phone with Craig Foster. The bank board meets on the 28th to finalize the end-of-year liquidations. Craig told me that unless you show proof of sale by then, the foreclosure paperwork will be filed on the morning of the 31st. Garrett pulled a folded document from his thick, insulated jacket and tossed it onto the kitchen table. "I'm a reasonable man, Ray," Garrett continued, leaning against the doorframe. "I know this farm has been in your family for 3 generations. It's a shame to see it auctioned off piece by piece to strangers. I've brought a formal purchase agreement. I will buy your north 400 acres for cash today. The price is 20% below market value, but it's enough to satisfy your debt to First Country Bank and pay off your bins. You keep the house, you keep the south acreage, and you retire with a little dignity. But the offer expires when I walk out this door." Jesse stepped forward, his fists clenched tight. "Get out of our house, Garrett. You're trying to steal our best-yielding soil while the market is artificially crushed." Garrett ignored the young man, keeping his eyes locked on Raymond. "The river is frozen tight, Ray. China canceled their December shipments. The market isn't artificially crushed, it's dead. Sign the paper. Save your wife the humiliation of an eviction." Raymond didn't look at the contract. He stared through Garrett, his cold eyes unblinking. "You don't understand the board, Garrett. You only understand the dirt under your boots. The river freezing isn't the end. It's the catalyst. Get off my property." Garrett's smile vanished. He snatched the contract off the table, his face turning red with sudden fury. "You're a stubborn old fool. On January 1st, I'll buy this whole place at the sheriff's auction for pennies, and I'll tear those stupid silver bins down just to clear the view." He slammed the door behind him. The house fell silent again, save for the ticking of the wall clock. Time was running out. It was December 18th. The trap was set, but the jaws hadn't snapped shut. Raymond walked into his office, turned on his computer, and waited. The global machine was grinding its gears, and the tension in the frozen Iowa air was becoming unbearable. The global agricultural market is a massive, interconnected beast that slumbers through the holidays, right up until the moment someone steps on its tail. On the morning of December 26th, the beast woke up screaming. At 6 in the morning, Raymond was sitting in the dark office, watching the pre-market electronic trading screens. The Chicago Board of Trade didn't officially open for open outcry until 8:30, but the overnight electronic Globex session was flashing like a police siren. His private phone rang. It was Warren Tully calling from Chicago. The retired broker sounded like he had just sprinted up a flight of stairs. "Ray, tell me you are looking at the wire," Tully shouted, the sound of frantic typing echoing in the background. "I'm looking at the overnight corn futures," Raymond replied calmly, tracing a finger across his monitor. "March contracts are up 12 cents. May is up 14. There's serious volume moving." "Forget the futures paper, look at the international wire," Tully yelled. "The Brazilian Agricultural Ministry just dropped an emergency revision. Their safrinha crop isn't just damaged, Ray, it's obliterated. The drought in Mato Grosso was worse than anyone calculated. They just slashed their export estimates by 25 million metric tons. They are declaring a domestic supply emergency and halting all forward export loading at the port of Santos." Raymond leaned forward in his chair. "The world is suddenly short on physical grain." "It gets better," Tully continued, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper. The multinational grain companies, the guys who own the deepwater ports in the Pacific Northwest, they heavily shorted the market in November, expecting cheap Brazilian corn to fulfill their Asian contracts in January. Now they have cargo ships idling off the coast of Japan, demanding grain that doesn't exist. They are panicking, Ray. They need physical American corn right now. But the Mississippi River is frozen solid. They can't float it down from the Midwest. "Which means," Raymond said, his voice as sharp as a razor, "they have to put it on trains." "Exactly. They are aggressively bidding for unit trains to run straight from the Midwest elevators to the Pacific ports. The cash basis is about to explode. Hold your position, Ray. Do not sell a single kernel." By noon, the tremors hit Cedar Creek. The local cash price at Hendricks Grain Terminal jumped 30 cents in an hour, a violent, unprecedented swing. But it wasn't enough. Raymond knew the big exporters were paying massive premiums behind the scenes. At 2 o'clock, a pristine white sports utility vehicle tore up the Kincaid driveway, spraying gravel and snow. Boyd Hendricks jumped out, nearly slipping on the ice. He didn't look like the confident elevator manager from October. He looked desperate, sweating heavily despite the freezing temperature. Raymond met him on the porch, Jesse stepping up right behind him. "Ray," Boyd panted, gripping the porch railing. "I need grain. I need physical grain today. I've got 100-car Union Pacific train sitting on my sidetrack right now. The buyer in the Pacific Northwest just offered me a massive premium if I can fill it by midnight. The local farmers have nothing left. They all sold to me at harvest, and I already shipped that out before the river froze." Raymond crossed his arms. "I thought you told me my corn was going to rot, Boyd. I thought the market had no bottom." "Things changed overnight," Boyd pleaded. "Look, I'll give you a sweetheart deal. $3.80 a bushel. That's 50 cents higher than yesterday. You sell me your 300,000 bushels right now, and you can walk into First Country Bank tomorrow and pay off Craig Foster in full. You save the farm, Ray. Just sign the contract." Jesse's eyes went wide. $3.80 would clear the debt. It wouldn't make them rich, but it meant survival. He grabbed his father's sleeve. "Dad, we have to take it. We beat the deadline." Raymond didn't look at his son. He kept his steely gaze locked on Boyd Hendricks. He knew the psychology of the elevator manager. If Boyd was offering $3.80 on the porch, it meant he was getting paid significantly more by the terminal. "What's the rail car bid, Boyd?" Raymond asked quietly. Boyd flinched. "What do you mean?" "I mean the direct track bid from the exporter," Raymond pressed, stepping off the porch to stand toe-to-toe with the elevator manager. "You are an intermediary. You take my grain, you put it on the train, and you take a massive cut. But you are desperate to fill those cars because if you default on the train freight, the railroad fines you $10,000 a day. You're trapped, Boyd." "Ray, don't be greedy," Boyd snapped, his face flushing. "I'm offering you a lifeline. First Country Bank is going to ruin you in 4 days. The track bid, Boyd. Tell me the number or get off my land." Boyd swallowed hard, glancing nervously at the massive silver bins towering behind the house. $4.20, he whispered bitterly. "The exporters are paying $4.20 delivered to the railhead." Jesse gasped. That wasn't just survival. That was a margin of profit they hadn't seen in 3 years. $4.20, Raymond repeated, letting the number hang in the frigid air. "That's a fair price for a world that suddenly realizes it's hungry." "So we have a deal?" Boyd asked, pulling a crumpled contract from his pocket. "I'll send the trucks immediately." "No," Raymond said softly. "We don't have a deal, because the train hasn't sat there long enough. Let those Union Pacific cars sit empty for another 48 hours, Boyd. Let the exporters sweat. Let them realize that the only physical corn left in this county is locked inside my steel bins. And when they realize they have absolutely no other option, then we will negotiate the price." "You're insane," Boyd screamed, throwing his hands in the air. "The market could correct tomorrow. The South American weather could change. You are risking your entire generational legacy on a 48-hour bluff." "It's not a bluff if you hold all the cards," Raymond replied, turning his back on the manager and walking into the house. "Close the gate on your way out, Boyd." Jesse stood frozen on the porch, watching Boyd's truck speed away. He walked into the kitchen, his whole body shaking. Whether from the cold or the sheer terror of what his father had just done, he didn't know. "Dad, you just turned down $1 million, Jesse stammered. "Craig Foster is going to take the land." Raymond sat down at the table, picking up his cold cup of coffee. He looked at his son, his expression softening just a fraction. "Jesse, you farm the dirt, but you trade the panic," Raymond said. "Right now, Boyd is panicking. Tomorrow, the exporters will panic. By the 28th, the world will panic. We have the grain. We dictate the terms." The silence in the farmhouse was deafening. Outside, the 4 massive silver bins stood like fortresses against the winter sky, holding the most valuable commodity in the county. The December 31st deadline was only 5 days away, and Raymond Kincaid had just bet his entire life on the final tick of the clock. He knew that when the sun rose tomorrow, the true test of wills would begin. Either the global market would bend to his unyielding patience, or the legacy of his family would be wiped out entirely by the ruthless stroke of a banker's pen. The waiting game was finally ending. The morning of December 28th broke with a brittle, blinding clarity. The temperature hovered at 9 degrees below zero, and the snowpack across Cedar Creek reflected the pale winter sun like a sea of crushed diamonds. Inside the First Country Bank, the atmosphere was entirely devoid of light or warmth. The main boardroom, located at the back of the brick building, smelled of stale coffee, leather polish, and the metallic tang of impending financial execution. Craig Foster sat at the head of the heavy mahogany conference table, his posture rigid, his dark suit impeccably pressed. To his immediate right sat two silent bank board members, elderly men who owned hardware stores and car dealerships, men who preferred their ledgers balanced and their risks non-existent. To Foster's left sat Garrett Foley. Garrett had shed his usual Carhartt work jacket for a quarter-zip cashmere sweater, looking less like a farmer and more like the corporate raider he desperately aspired to be. A thick manila folder rested beneath Garrett's massive, calloused hands. At precisely 9 o'clock, the heavy oak door creaked open. Raymond Kincaid walked into the room, his heavy canvas coat smelling faintly of diesel fuel and raw wind. Jesse followed closely behind, his face pale, his jaw set in a tight, nervous line. Neither man removed his boots. They brought the cold reality of the farm directly onto the pristine carpet. "Good morning, Ray, Jesse," Craig Foster said, his voice carrying the practiced, somber tone of an undertaker. He gestured to the two empty leather chairs across the table. "Please, have a seat. We have a considerable amount of ground to cover, and our window for resolution is rapidly closing." Raymond did not sit. He stood behind the leather chair, resting his large, scarred hands on the high backrest. His icy blue eyes swept the room, lingering for a fraction of a second on Garrett's arrogant smirk before returning to the banker. "I prefer to stand, Craig." "State your business." "The fans are running on my bins, and I have work waiting at home." Foster frowned, clearly annoyed by the breach of protocol. He opened his leather-bound portfolio, aligning the paperwork with geometric precision. "Very well, Ray. As we discussed on the 5th of this month, your operating line of credit, totaling $450,000, matures at the close of business on December 31st. Additionally, your annual mortgage installment of $120,000 is due on the exact same day. Based on the local cash price at the Hendricks elevator, the total liquidation value of your stored grain does not satisfy your outstanding liabilities, nor does it leave you with sufficient operating capital for the spring planting season." Foster steepled his fingers, looking up with a gaze devoid of empathy. "Because you failed to secure a forward contract during the harvest, the bank's risk assessment committee has officially denied the renewal of your operating note. Consequently, we have drafted the foreclosure paperwork. We are prepared to file it with the county courthouse on the morning of the 31st. Jesse's breathing grew shallow. He looked at the paperwork on the table, seeing the culmination of 3 generations of blood, sweat, and unpredictable weather reduced to a stack of legal jargon. Garrett Foley seized the silence. He leaned forward, sliding his manila folder across the polished mahogany surface until it stopped inches from Raymond's hands. "Ray, I told you I was a reasonable man," Garrett said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I don't want to see Jesse here lose his entire inheritance, and I certainly don't want to see you and Sarah put out on the county road. Inside that folder is a certified cashier's check and a deed of sale. I am offering you $570,000 for the North 400 acres. It pays off the bank entirely. You walk away with 0 debt. All you have to do is sign the land over to my corporation, and Craig here will shred the foreclosure notice." Garrett leaned back, crossing his arms behind his head. "It's the only lifeline you have left, Ray. Take the deal. You played the market, and the market broke you. It happens to proud men all the time." Raymond stared at the folder. He didn't reach for it. He didn't even blink. The silence in the boardroom stretched out, tight and vibrating like a wire pulled to the breaking point. "Craig," Raymond said, his voice rumbling low in his chest, entirely ignoring Garrett's existence. You ran your risk assessment based on the local cash price at the Hendricks elevator. Is that correct? That is correct, Foster replied defensively. Boyd Hendricks represents the standard accessible market for this county. His price is the price. Boyd Hendricks is a middleman, Raymond countered, his tone perfectly flat. He buys grain, takes a margin, and sells it to the international exporters. But Boyd Hendricks doesn't control the logistics right now, Craig. The Mississippi River is frozen solid. There are 0 barges moving north of St. Louis, which means the exporters in the Pacific Northwest, the ones who shorted their contracts to Asia, are currently defaulting on their physical delivery obligations. Garrett scoffed loudly. Oh, listen to him, Craig. He's reading the Wall Street Journal again and thinks he's a commodity broker. Ray, nobody cares about the Pacific Northwest. We are in Iowa. Your grain is stuck in Iowa. Raymond finally looked directly at Garrett, his eyes burning with a cold, intense fire. It's stuck because men like you dug it out of the ground in October and handed it to Boyd Hendricks for pennies, creating a local glut. You let the elevator dictate the terms. You gave away your leverage. Raymond unzipped his heavy canvas coat. He reached into the inner breast pocket and pulled out a single, folded sheet of heavy, watermarked paper. He tossed it onto the mahogany table. It landed perfectly on top of Garrett's manila folder. I didn't give away my leverage, Raymond said softly. I locked it inside 4 steel bins and waited for the world to starve. Craig Foster leaned forward, his brow furrowing. He picked up the paper, adjusting his reading glasses. As his eyes scanned the document, the color rapidly drained from his face, leaving him looking like a wax mannequin. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. What is it, Craig? Garrett demanded, his smugness faltering at the sight of the banker's pale face. What kind of fake spreadsheet did he print off the internet? It's not a spreadsheet, Garrett, Foster stammered, his hands visibly shaking as he held the paper. It's an executed direct-to-rail procurement contract. It's issued by Global Pacific Grain, the largest multinational exporter on the West Coast. Jesse's head snapped up, staring at his father in absolute shock. Raymond had been on the phone constantly for the last 48 hours, locking himself in the freezing farm office, but he had refused to tell Jesse the exact details of the negotiations. Read the terms, Craig, Raymond commanded, his voice echoing off the oak-paneled walls. Read them out loud so Garrett can understand how the real market works. Foster swallowed hard, his eyes glued to the numbers. The contract stipulates the immediate physical purchase of 300,000 bushels of number 2 yellow corn, delivered directly to the Union Pacific railhead in Cedar Creek. The banker paused, as if the next sequence of words physically pained him to speak. The contracted price is $5.20 per bushel. It includes a total 0 deduction for moisture, provided it ships within 24 hours. Garrett Foley bolted out of his chair, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. That's impossible. That is a blatant lie. The Chicago board is trading at $3.40. Nobody is paying a $2 premium for cash corn in December. They pay it when they are facing a $10 million default penalty on an Asian cargo ship, Raymond said, his voice completely devoid of mercy. Boyd Hendricks tried to fill a 100-car unit train for them 3 days ago, but he didn't have the physical inventory. He shipped everything out at harvest. The train has been sitting on the sidetrack, racking up $10,000 a day in railroad demurrage fees. So, I bypassed Boyd entirely. My broker in Chicago contacted the head of logistics at Global Pacific Grain directly. I told them I had exactly the volume they needed, perfectly conditioned, sitting 3 miles from the tracks. I named my price. They didn't even negotiate. Foster pulled a calculator toward him, his fingers trembling as he punched in the numbers. 300,000 bushels at $5.20. Ray, the gross contract value is $1,560,000. Jesse let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. He gripped the edge of the conference table, his legs suddenly feeling weak. They weren't just saved, they were rich. Garrett, Raymond said, leaning over the table, bringing his face inches from the massive farm operator. "Take your check, take your deed, and never step foot on my property again. My land is not for sale." Garrett's mouth worked silently. He looked at the banker for support, but Foster was already aggressively typing on his computer, desperately trying to verify the wire transfer routing numbers printed at the bottom of the Global Pacific contract. Defeated, humiliated, and outplayed, Garrett snatched his folder off the table and stormed out of the boardroom, slamming the heavy oak door so hard the glass light fixtures rattled. Raymond turned his attention back to the banker. "The first 100,000 bushels are loading onto the exporter's trucks as we speak, Craig. The funds will wire directly into this bank by 4 o'clock this afternoon. You will deduct the exact balance of my operating note and my land mortgage, down to the final penny. The remaining surplus stays in my checking account." Foster, completely stripped of his former arrogance, nodded rapidly. "Of course, Ray. Immediately. Consider the debts cleared. And if you need anything for the spring planting season, First Country Bank would be honored to expand your credit facilities." "I won't be needing credit this spring, Craig," Raymond said, finally stepping away from the chair. He turned to his son. "Come on, Jesse. We have a train to load." The scene at the Cedar Creek railhead was a symphony of industrial chaos. The usually quiet gravel lot alongside the Union Pacific tracks was swarming with a fleet of 18-wheelers. But these weren't the local, mud-splattered farm trucks that normally hauled grain. These were pristine, aerodynamic logistics haulers contracted directly out of Chicago by Global Pacific Grain. Standing on the elevated metal grating of the rail loading platform, Boyd Hendricks watched his entire local monopoly crumble before his eyes. The massive train cars were being filled, but not through his elevator system. The trucks were pulling directly up to the high-speed transfer augers, bypassing Boyd's scales, bypassing his storage, and entirely bypassing his profit margin. 3 miles away, the Kincaid farm was shaking the frozen earth. Raymond and Jesse stood at the base of the massive silver bins. The deafening roar of the unloading system drowned out the winter wind. A continuous, shimmering, golden waterfall of corn was pouring from the belly of the steel silos directly into the waiting trailers of the corporate trucks. Jesse watched the grain flow, his mind struggling to comprehend the sheer scale of what they had just accomplished. For 3 months, he had viewed those steel bins as a prison. He had looked at the massive pile of corn as a suffocating weight that was dragging his family into bankruptcy. He had believed the town gossips, he had feared the bankers, and he had almost broken under the pressure of the falling local prices. But his father had seen something entirely different. Raymond hadn't just grown corn, he had manufactured leverage. He understood that the commodity market was an illusion, designed to separate panicked farmers from their hard-earned assets. The real market wasn't dictated by the ticker on a screen, it was dictated by physical possession, global weather patterns, and the ruthless choke points of international logistics. A truck driver in a heavy high-visibility jacket jumped down from his cab, holding a clipboard. He ran over to Raymond, shouting over the roar of the machinery. "Mr. Kincaid, that's trailer number 40 loaded to the legal limit. The dispatcher says we have enough fleet rotation to clear the remaining 200,000 bushels by midnight." Raymond nodded, signing the bill of lading with a gloved hand. "Keep them moving, son. The rail cars are waiting." As the truck roared off down the driveway, sending a spray of snow and gravel into the freezing air, Sarah Kincaid walked out of the farmhouse. She was wrapped in a thick wool coat, carrying 2 steaming insulated thermoses of coffee. She didn't look tired anymore. The heavy dark circles that had haunted her eyes since October were completely gone. She handed a thermos to Jesse, then walked over to Raymond. Leaning against his shoulder, they stood together in silence for a long moment, watching the golden grain pour out of the iron bins, turning from a liability into absolute financial freedom. "Craig Foster called the house 10 minutes ago," Sarah said, raising her voice to be heard over the auger. "The wire transfer cleared the Federal Reserve. It hit our account, Ray. The operating note is zeroed out. The mortgage is zeroed out. The bins are entirely paid off." and there is over $900,000 in liquid cash sitting in the checking account. Raymond took a slow sip of the hot coffee, the steam rising around his weathered face. He didn't smile, but the hard, defensive tension that had gripped his jaw for 90 days finally melted away. "We buy our seed and fertilizer with cash this February," Raymond said quietly to his wife. "No more operating loans. We don't owe the bank a single drop of sweat for the rest of our lives." Jesse walked over, putting his arm around his father's broad shoulders. The young man looked up at the towering, partially emptied silos. They were no longer monsters. They were monuments to an iron will. "I was wrong, Dad," Jesse said, his voice thick with emotion. "I wanted to surrender in October. I wanted to take Boyd's price just to stop the bleeding. If I was running this farm, Garrett Foley would be measuring our fields right now." Raymond turned to his son, his blue eyes softening. "Jesse, farming isn't about planting seeds. Any fool can put a seed in the dirt and watch it grow. Farming is warfare. It's a war against the weather, against the banks, and against the corporate giants who want to take your labor for nothing. You can never let them see you panic. The moment you act out of fear, you lose." Raymond pointed a calloused finger at the golden stream of corn rushing into the next waiting truck. "The harvest is an illusion," Raymond continued, his voice steady and powerful. "October is a trap designed for desperate men. The real harvest doesn't happen in the field. It happens in the mind. You wait until the world realizes it's starving, and then you make them pay for the plate." The wind howled across the frozen Iowa prairie, but inside the Kincaid farmyard, the air felt warm, alive, and victorious. The farmer who refused to sell a single bushel at harvest had just rewritten the rules of the game, and as the last golden kernels of the 300,000 bushel gamble poured into the trucks, Raymond Kincaid finally allowed himself to smile. By late January, the deep freeze that paralyzed the Midwest began to thaw, but the financial landscape of Cedar Creek was permanently fractured. The story of Raymond Kincaid's multi-million-dollar direct rail sale spread far beyond the county lines, reaching corporate boardrooms in Chicago and Minneapolis. Raymond had not just survived the brutal winter, he had completely exposed the vulnerability of the entire local grain purchasing cartel. At the Hendricks Grain Terminal, the mood was funereal. Boyd Hendricks sat in his dusty office, staring blindly at a notice of termination from his corporate parent company. By failing to secure physical grain needed to fill the Union Pacific unit train in December, Boyd triggered a catastrophic chain of freight default penalties. Because Raymond bypassed the local system, the terminal lost its most lucrative export contract. Boyd packed his styrofoam cups and framed photographs into a cardboard box. The arrogant manager who sneered at Raymond's bins was now out of a job, his reputation entirely shattered. But the hardest, most devastating dose of financial karma was reserved for Garrett Foley. Garrett built his massive, sprawling farming empire on a precarious foundation of highly aggressive leverage. He leased the newest combines every year, financed inputs on corporate credit, and routinely outbid smaller farmers, assuming the volume of his harvest would cover his immense overhead. He operated under the arrogant assumption that he could swallow up vulnerable neighbors like Raymond whenever the market dipped, using their liquidated land to balance his dangerous debt-to-asset ratios. When Garrett stormed out of First Country Bank on December 28th, he didn't just lose the Kincaid land, he lost his financial safety net. On a dreary, bitter Tuesday morning in late February, the roles were brutally reversed. Garrett Foley sat across the polished mahogany table in the First Country Bank executive boardroom, his cashmere sweater replaced by a wrinkled flannel workshirt. Craig Foster did not offer him a polite smile. "The board reviewed your spring requests, Garrett," Foster said, his tone entirely stripped of the warmth he had shown the large operator 2 months prior. "Your equipment liabilities are staggering. Because you sold your entire crop at the absolute bottom of the market in October, your cash flow is severely insufficient to service the interest on your fleet of combines. Without the acquisition of the Kincaid property to shore up your fragile equity, we view your operation as critically over-leveraged." Garrett's large hands physically shook as he gripped the edge of the heavy, solid wooden table. Craig, you know my yields. I farm more dirt than anyone else in this county. You cannot freeze my credit line right before spring planting begins. I have massive prepay contracts for liquid fertilizer due on Friday. We aren't freezing your line, Foster replied coldly, sliding a thick legal document across the table. We are calling the notes on your equipment. The bank is repossessing 4 of your combines and 6 of your heavy tractors, effective immediately. You will need to rapidly scale down your operation by 2,000 acres this spring. We are actively liquidating your excess leased ground to cover the immediate cash shortfall. Garrett stared blankly at the repossession notice, the color draining from his face until he looked ill. The apex predator of Cedar Creek had become the prey. The bank was stripping his farming empire for parts, utilizing the exact same ruthless mathematics he had tried to inflict on Raymond Kincaid. 2 years later, the Kincaid farm stood proudly as an impenetrable fortress of agricultural independence. The 4 original silver grain bins had been joined by 2 massive new additions, expanding their total capacity to a staggering 500,000 bushels. They had constructed the new infrastructure entirely with cash, refusing to borrow a single dime from First Country Bank. The dynamics of the Kincaid farm fundamentally shifted. Raymond, now 60, spent significantly less time in the tractor cab and far more time in the renovated farm office. He relentlessly tracked global weather patterns and studied foreign maritime shipping logs with the intensity of a seasoned Wall Street trader. He became a legendary figure in quiet, regional agricultural circles, the quiet man who outsmarted corporate exporters from a freezing shed in rural Iowa. The most profound transformation, however, rightfully belonged to Jesse Kincaid. Jesse no longer stared at the fluctuating commodities app on his smartphone with a sense of existential dread. He no longer cared what the local elevator manager was bidding for cash corn, and he certainly no longer feared the suited bankers sitting in town. As he walked across the gravel yard, he moved with the heavy, grounded confidence of a young man who truly understood the underlying mechanics of global power. It was a clear October afternoon. The autumn harvest was in full swing across the county. A mile down the highway, a long line of semi-trucks was already forming outside the cooperative elevator. Exhausted farmers were queuing up, anxiously waiting to surrender their grain for whatever meager price the local market dictated that day. Jesse stood on the top catwalk of their newest Brock grain bin, 70 feet in the air, looking down at the thriving Kincaid property. Their own harvest operations were proceeding efficiently, but not a single heavy transport truck was heading toward the town elevator. Far below him, the state-of-the-art grain dryer hummed, perfectly conditioning their freshly cut corn as it flowed into the steel silos. Raymond slowly climbed the vertical metal ladder, joining his son on the narrow catwalk. The autumn wind whipped fiercely around them, carrying the sweet, familiar scent of dried corn and falling leaves. Test weight is coming in remarkably heavy today, Dad, Jesse noted, pulling his thick leather work gloves tight against the chill. Moisture is holding at exactly 17%. The dryer is bringing it down to a perfect 14.5. It will keep safely inside these bins for 2 full years if we absolutely need it to. Raymond rested his forearms heavily on the cold metal railing, looking out over their vast, completely debt-free acres of land. What exactly is the Chicago board doing today, Jesse? Chicago is down 6 cents across the board, Jesse replied, a confident smile playing on his lips. The local basis is actively widening. Everyone in town is completely panicking, rushing their trucks to the elevator to sell before the price drops any further. They genuinely think the market is collapsing. And what do you think? Raymond asked, quietly testing the boy's resolve. Jesse turned away from the distant, pathetic line of commercial trucks and looked directly into his father's eyes. I think the Argentine river system is currently experiencing a historically severe low water event, which will severely throttle their export loading capacity by late December. I think the European Union is going to fall drastically short on their feed wheat projections, inevitably forcing them to pivot to purchasing American corn by mid-January. I think the local panic is nothing but noise. We lock the bins today, we turn on the aeration fans tonight, and we patiently wait for the desperate exporters to call us. Raymond placed a heavy, calloused hand firmly on his son's shoulder, his blue eyes gleaming with profound, immeasurable pride. The boy had finally evolved into a true farmer, not just a mere tiller of the soil, but a calculated master of the board. "That's exactly right, Jesse," Raymond said softly, his voice carrying easily over the wind. "Let them wait in line. We don't farm for pennies anymore. We farm for the premium." Down in the valley, the green combines continued to tear aggressively through the dry, golden fields, kicking up massive, swirling clouds of dust into the crisp air. The corporate middlemen, ruthless neighbors, and the bankers had all tried to break the Kincaid family. They weaponized debt and manipulated local prices, but they fundamentally misunderstood the man they were fighting. Raymond Kincaid realized the ultimate truth of the modern agricultural world. He who controls the physical commodity controls the timeline. He turned steel bins into an impenetrable vault, patience into a weapon, and timing into a multi-million-dollar legacy. The farm would never again beg a local elevator for a fair price. As winter winds gathered on the horizon, promising another season of chaos, the massive silver silos stood like immovable titans, fully loaded, patiently waiting for the world to come knocking. If the incredible multi-million-dollar gamble of Raymond Kincaid inspired you today, hit that like button right now. This story proves that true wealth does not come from following the panicked crowd. It comes from patience, an iron will, and understanding the real mechanics of the global market. Do not let the middlemen dictate your worth. Share this thrilling real-life story with any friends, family, or fellow farmers who need a massive dose of motivation today. If you want to hear more high-stakes stories about everyday people beating a rigged system, please subscribe to our channel.